The city sat where the land frayed into water, concrete dissolving into salt and wind. Luca Voss liked places like that, edges, margins, zones where things slipped. It made sense for someone who made his living chasing stories nobody could quite place. Not scandals, not conspiracies in the loud sense. He preferred the quieter kind. The ones that felt older than language. The fragment arrived without context, slipped under his apartment door in a plain envelope. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of brittle paper, photographed and reprinted too many times. Along the top, a crude diagram, 7 human silhouettes drawn in a line, each one marked differently. One was tethered at the feet, roots sinking downward. Another bound at the chest. A third wrapped at the head. 2 more were sketched with tangled lines looping inward, as if folding on themselves. The 6th was faint, barely outlined. And the 7th, drawn last, had a line running straight up through its skull, piercing a rough arc that Luca assumed was meant to be the sky. Below the drawing, a sentence, "He drew this in the sand before they took him." Luca stared at it longer than he meant to. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't, but because something about the spacing felt deliberate, almost instructional. Whoever drew it wasn't trying to impress. They were trying to explain. He spent the next 2 days doing what he always did first, nothing visible. No calls, no posts, no messages. He let the image sit, letting his mind circle it without forcing meaning. Patterns had a way of revealing themselves when you didn't rush them. On the 3rd day, he noticed the binding points. Feet. Chest. Head. Luca pulled out an anatomy chart, then a notebook filled with old marginalia from interviews with mystics, monks, and defectors from closed spiritual orders. He'd heard variations before, body-bound, emotion-bound, thought-bound, but never arranged like this. Never with 7. He scanned the fragment again at high resolution. In the background grain, barely visible, were footprints. Bare feet. Multiple sizes. Someone had been standing around whoever drew this, watching. The first solid lead came from a librarian named Irina Cade, recently dismissed from a private archive outside the city. Luca found her through a back channel, a message forwarded 3 times before it reached her. She agreed to meet only if he didn't bring recording equipment. They met at a cafe that smelled like old books and burnt espresso. Irina was careful with her words, not paranoid exactly, just precise. "I've seen versions of that diagram," she said, glancing once at the folded print before pushing it back across the table. "Never in public collections. Always in restricted annexes. Always misfiled." "Misfiled how?" Luca asked. "Under anthropology. Or heresies. Or children's drawings." She smiled thinly. "Anything but what they are." "And what are they?" "Instructional models," she said. "Not beliefs. Not metaphors. Models." That word again. Irina explained that the earliest copy she'd handled was attributed to an unnamed teacher, dated roughly 2 centuries ago, though the paper itself was newer. The margin note claimed it was a reproduction of something far older, drawn in sand during a gathering near a shoreline not unlike their own. "They said he didn't lecture," she said. "He demonstrated. He'd draw. Then erase. Then draw again until someone understood." "Understood what?" "That humans don't all function the same way," Irina replied. "Not spiritually. Not psychologically. Fundamentally." Luca felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the feeling that came when a story threatened to become too big to carry comfortably. That night, the dream started. Not vivid, not symbolic. Just repetition. He was standing on wet sand, watching someone draw shapes at his feet. Every time he leaned closer to see, a wave came in and erased the lines before he could understand them. He woke up with the sense of having missed something obvious. He began reaching out to others. A retired therapist who'd worked with cult survivors. A former seminarian who'd left the church and never quite landed anywhere else. A street artist known for painting human figures with broken halos and roots for legs. The stories didn't match in details, but the structure echoed. Some people, they said, seemed entirely anchored in survival, food, status, reproduction, fear. Others lived inside emotion, cycling endlessly through loyalty and resentment. Some were trapped in thought, mistaking cleverness for clarity. And then there were the rare ones who didn't quite fit, who asked the wrong questions too early, who felt misplaced even when successful. 7 kept coming up. Not as doctrine, but as an observation. Luca mapped the accounts on his wall, stringing connections between interviews, dates, locations. Patterns emerged. Whenever the 7th was mentioned, never directly, always as the one who sees, or the unbound, or simply the problem, the records thinned. Names redacted. Pages missing. Careers ended abruptly. One interview ended before it began. The former seminarian cancelled an hour before they were supposed to meet, sending only a single line, "I shouldn't have agreed. Please stop looking." That unsettled Luca more than outright threats ever had. He returned to the diagram. The 7th figure wasn't larger or more ornate. It was simpler. Cleaner. The line through it didn't branch or twist. It just went up. He wondered who decided that line was dangerous. Digging deeper, he found references to a coastal incident decades earlier. A small, informal gathering. No leader named. No manifesto. Just a note in a municipal report about disturbances caused by non-compliant assemblies. The location matched the kind of place described in Irina's account. Luca went there at dawn. The beach was empty except for gulls and a man walking a dog. The sand was smooth, untouched. He stood where the water met land and imagined 7 figures drawn at his feet, imagined someone kneeling, explaining patiently while others listened. A strange calm settled over him. Not revelation. Not certainty. Just the sense that the diagram wasn't asking to be believed. It was asking to be recognized. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. A new message. No sender ID. You're looking at the wrong time. The drawing isn't history. It's a filter. Luca stared at the screen, then back at the sand as a wave rolled in and erased his footprints. For the first time since the fragment arrived, he understood what unsettled him most. If the diagram was accurate, if it described different operating modes of being human, then most conflicts, institutions, even moral systems weren't failures. They were maintenance. And the 7th figure wasn't rare because it was special. It was rare because it didn't stay put. Luca stopped sharing updates after the message about the filter. Not out of fear, but because the tone had shifted. Before, the material felt archival, distant, like dust shaken from old shelves. Now it felt responsive. As if something had noticed his attention and adjusted accordingly. He spent days reviewing interviews he hadn't taken seriously enough the first time. Small phrases stood out now, glowing with delayed relevance. Some people don't stabilize. They keep slipping through roles. You can't build anything permanent around them. The retired therapist, Jonah Pell, had said it casually, almost fondly. At the time, Luca assumed it was poetic license. Now he wasn't so sure. Jonah agreed to speak again, but only over a walk. No rooms, he'd said. Walls listen better than people think. They walked along a canal where the water moved slowly, carrying debris from elsewhere. Jonah explained that in his years working with defectors from closed groups, he'd noticed an unspoken classification system. Leaders never taught it explicitly. They didn't need to. You watch how people respond to pressure, Jonah said. Scarcity. Authority. Uncertainty. Most settle into predictable loops. That's not an insult, it's efficiency. Systems love predictability. And the others? Luca asked. Jonah smiled without humor. The ones who don't loop. They're expensive. Psychologically, socially. They destabilize group narratives just by asking the wrong kind of questions. Luca told him about the 7 silhouettes. Jonah didn't react with surprise. I've seen that framework, he said. Not with numbers. With functions. 3 that anchor reality. 2 that interpret it. 2 that disrupt it. Disrupt how? By refusing to internalize the story that keeps everything running. The escalation Luca had been sensing became tangible that week. His footage backups corrupted themselves without explanation. A scheduled interviewee vanished, phone disconnected, social accounts scrubbed. When Luca visited her listed address, the apartment was empty, the landlord insisting no one by that name had ever lived there. It would have sounded paranoid if it weren't so consistent. At night, the dreams changed. He wasn't watching the drawing anymore. He was standing among the silhouettes. 6 of them faced forward, eyes unfocused, bodies heavy. The 7th kept turning, scanning the horizon, unsettled. Every time Luca tried to speak to it, something pulled him awake. He followed a lead to a defunct seminary turned co-working space, now hosting pop-up lectures and mindfulness workshops. One speaker, a soft-spoken archivist named Tomas Rel, had been quietly circulating an idea he called functional consciousness variance. The title was dry enough to avoid attention. The content was not. Tomas described humanity as a mixed system, not a unified one. Different internal architectures responding to reality in incompatible ways. Most institutions, he argued, were built by and for the majority types. Not out of malice, but necessity. The problem, Tomas said during a recorded talk Luca later watched, is that systems mistake minority variance for malfunction. And then they try to correct it. Luca tracked Tomas down after the event. They met in a hallway lined with plants nobody watered. 7, Luca said without preamble. Tomas exhaled. So you've seen it. He explained that the 7-fold model wasn't mystical in origin. It was observational, refined over centuries by teachers who noticed recurring patterns in how people perceived meaning, authority, and selfhood. Over time, the model became inconvenient. Once you realize not everyone experiences reality the same way, Tomas said, moral universals get messy. Obedience becomes unreliable. You can't threaten everyone with the same story. So it was suppressed, Luca said. Edited, Tomas corrected. Reframed. Spiritualized. Turned into metaphor. Anything to keep it from being operational. Luca asked about the 7th. Tomas hesitated. They don't anchor identity in external narratives, he said carefully. Which means they're hard to govern. Hard to frighten. Hard to recruit. And hard to erase. Luca asked. Harder, Tomas said. But not impossible. The interference peaked the night Luca tried to upload a preliminary cut of his documentary to a private server. His internet went down citywide, according to the provider. When it returned hours later, the file was intact, but altered. A single frame had been inserted near the end. 7 silhouettes. One line breaking upward. Not from his footage. He felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, not fear, but recognition. The story wasn't being blocked. It was being guided. The next morning, a package arrived. Inside was a notebook bound in cracked leather. No note. The handwriting inside shifted styles every few pages, as if multiple people had contributed over decades. Observations. Diagrams. Warnings. One entry stood out: when the 7th wakes, the system doesn't attack immediately. It waits. It surrounds. It offers meaning. Luca realized then that suppression wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was seductive. Careers. Platforms. Movements. All designed to absorb the disruptive type back into something manageable. He thought of the people who'd cancelled interviews, who'd gone quiet. Maybe they hadn't been silenced. Maybe they'd been reassigned. The final page of the notebook was newer than the rest. A single sentence, written with deliberate calm. If you want to understand the seventh, don't look for leaders. Look for catalysts. Below it was a name. Mara Elt. Luca closed the notebook slowly. He didn't know yet who she was or what role she played, but he felt the story tightening into focus. Not a revelation. A convergence. Whatever the seventh was, it wasn't waiting to be discovered. It was already moving. Luca didn't rush to contact Mara Elt. The name felt less like a lead and more like a boundary marker, something you crossed only once you were ready to deal with the consequences. Instead, he watched. He traced digital footprints, not to profile her, but to see how the world reacted around her. There wasn't much to find. No public persona. No thought leadership. No attempts at influence. Mara appeared in records only indirectly, community projects that dissolved quietly after she left, study groups that never formalized, workplaces where productivity spiked briefly before management intervened and restructured everything back to normal. She didn't disrupt by force. She disrupted by presence. Luca finally met her at a small repair cafe operating out of an old transit station. People brought broken appliances, radios, old phones. Mara didn't run the place. She moved through it, helping when asked, listening more than speaking. When she looked at someone, she seemed to look through the noise they wrapped themselves in. They talked outside, away from the hum of conversation and tools. "You're not here to expose anything," she said after he explained why he'd come. "It wasn't a question." "I thought I was," Luca replied. "Now I'm not sure that's possible." Mara nodded. Exposure assumes something is hidden. This isn't hidden. It's disremembered. She spoke carefully, not like someone delivering a message, but like someone aligning pieces that were already present. She described how certain people, rare, but consistent across cultures, experienced identity differently. Not as a role to be maintained, but as a process in motion. They didn't feel fundamentally broken inside systems, just misaligned. "When I was younger," she said, "people kept trying to give me language. Labels. Diagnoses. Beliefs. None of them stuck." Luca asked if she knew about the sevenfold model. She smiled faintly. "I knew about myself long before I knew the diagram. The diagram just helped me understand why the reactions were always the same. Those reactions," she explained, "followed a pattern. Initial curiosity. Then admiration. Then pressure. Invitations to lead. To formalize. To become a symbol. When she declined, the tone shifted. Funding vanished. Doors closed. Narratives changed. "They don't want the seventh erased," Mara said. "They want it fixed in place." Luca thought of the notebook's warning. It offers meaning. Mara described how older institutions had once understood this distinction clearly. Teachers identified catalysts early, not to elevate them, but to protect the surrounding structure from destabilization. Over time, that knowledge became dangerous. Naming the seventh made control uneven. "So they changed the story," Luca said. "They moralized it," Mara replied. "Turned self-recognition into pride. Independence into rebellion. Remembering into heresy." She told him about texts burned not because they were false, but because they were practical. They taught people to recognize their own operating mode, and, more importantly, to stop trying to force everyone into the same one. Luca asked what happened when a seventh awakened others. Mara paused. "They don't awaken others directly," she said. "They create conditions where people notice themselves." That was the real threat. Not overthrow. Not revolt. Quiet, irreversible recognition. As if to prove the point, a man approached them mid-conversation. He looked unsettled, not distressed, just disoriented. "I don't know why," he said to Mara, "but after talking to you last week, I quit my job." Not impulsively. Calmly. It just stopped making sense. Mara listened. She didn't celebrate. She didn't guide him. She simply nodded. After he left, Luca felt the weight of what he was documenting. This wasn't a story that ended with revelation or victory. There was no climax to film. Only diffusion. Institutions had learned this too. They no longer relied on fire or prisons. They relied on absorption. Turning disruption into lifestyle. Selling awakening as branding. Keeping it safe, marketable, and ultimately hollow. That's why the old libraries burned. Not out of fear of ideas, but fear of function. Once people could locate themselves honestly within the system, many structures lost their leverage overnight. Luca asked Mara what would happen if his documentary went public. She considered it. Some will feel seen. Most will feel attacked. A few will feel nothing at all. "And you?" he asked. "I'll keep doing what I do," she said. Catalysts don't scale. That's the point. As Luca left the station, he realized the documentary was no longer about 7 types. It was about permission, the permission to stop forcing alignment where none existed. The diagram wasn't a prophecy. It was a diagnostic. And the 7th figure wasn't ascending. It was stepping aside. If you've stayed with this story until now, you've probably noticed something subtle. Nothing here asked you to believe. There was no doctrine offered, no enemy named, no identity to adopt. That's intentional. Stories like this aren't meant to replace one system with another. They're meant to interrupt the reflex to outsource self-understanding. Some of you will recognize yourselves in parts of this. Others won't, and that's not a failure. Not everyone is meant to resonate with the same frameworks. That, ironically, is the entire point. If this video unsettled you, let it. Sit with the discomfort instead of rushing to label it. If it clarified something you felt but never named, take that clarity quietly. You don't need to announce it. Recognition works best when it's allowed to integrate slowly. This channel isn't about answers. It's about tracing the edges of questions we were never taught how to ask without fear. If you want to continue exploring stories like this, carefully, without hype or panic, consider subscribing so you don't lose the thread when the next one appears. If you found value here, a simple like helps this video reach people who may need it without even knowing why yet. And if you know someone who's always felt slightly out of place in the world, sharing this might offer them a mirror rather than a message. Thanks for watching.